Okay, so this is my second video. My first one I'm gonna say was, I'm pretty happy with it. I think it was a success. There were some errors. I am all about healthy criticism and feedback, and I also critiqued myself when I looked at the video. First mistake, obviously we knew I didn't have it flipped the right way, so I couldn't see myself. And when I had that wonderful dramatic line of, we get to put a face to the voice, you got to meet all three of me. All three of me. This kind of zoomed in. The top half of my head was chopped off the whole video. But like I said, I don't know how to edit, and it's not like I could reveal over on the first try. So I had to go with it, and it's okay. I think things are going to work out. And as you can see, I'm already learning from prior video. I've got the camera raised a little higher on my table. It's sitting on a camel that my mother gave me. It's a cast iron camel. It's gorgeous. I know that sounds weird, but it's great. As I promised, I'm wearing all the stuff. The lipstick too. I debated about putting it back on because I don't know if you know this, but it feels weird. Like, I can actually feel that there's stuff on my lips. I got the gloves on, and I have the wonderful book with the little letter opener as a bookmark, plus my paper. So this thing is really cool. I get it now. It's supposed to resemble the dagger that's on the cover. And the little box, I realized later after I was filming that we opened first, there's the Tower of London on the cover as well. I don't know if you can see it, but there it is. And so everything is looking really good. So as promised, we're going to read to page 49. That is where the next gift is. Says open at end of page 49. So that will do. I also realized yesterday that as I was talking and reading, I got very thirsty and was too afraid to get up and leave. So I brought my trusty thingy right here. I don't know how censorship works, so none of this is meant to sell or anything, but it's a chocolatey goodness drink. Also known as Yoo-Hoo. So yeah, there's that. I also realized in the video that I made a few more mistakes in this book reading because I didn't read the pages prior. I also didn't do that this time. I'm going to see how well I do. So hopefully I won't trip up on a lot of the words because it's very anatomically correct. Talking about derma and viscera and precision cutting and crimson blood. So it's definitely different from what I usually read. So we'll see if I stumble and trip up a lot, then what I'll probably do before the next video is read the pages prior, so then that way I already kind of have an idea of what's coming, so I won't make as many mistakes. I also learned that the length of my video was very long. So this one, I'm just doing it by trial and error. Once I get to the pages that I'm supposed to read, I will post it no matter how long it is or how short, and I'll just learn as I go. Better techniques, better editing. I don't even know how to edit. I'll learn all that as I go. So if you happen to see this video and you see progress, or you think you've got any tips for me, you can do the subscribe-y thing and the comment thing, which I actually learned about because my fiance went on and he subscribed to my channel, and he may or may not have left a comment. I haven't checked that part, but he said he was going to, so I'll get to learn the mechanics of reading comments and responding to them. So hopefully you enjoy the second installment of Stalking Jack the Ripper by, and of course we know that I had trouble with this last name, Kerri Maniscalco. That's what we're going with. my trusty bookmark, which is letting me know that we are trying to get to the end of page 49. Okay, so our first video, we finished the first 2 chapters. We're now starting on chapter 3. There is an awesome picture. I'm assuming, if you can see this, this is one of the diagrams in her journal. It looks like it's a heart. She's got the bladder, oh, maybe not. The bladder distended, so it's a distended bladder. B, lymphos, like I said, this thing is anatomically correct, and I can't read her scrawly, scriptic writing, so, maybe it's lymphosis of the polus? I don't know. Anyway, it's an illustration of the heart and bladder from Thomas Graham's notebook. Oh, from Thomas's! The so far mysterious, broody kind of male that she was talking to. Alright, we'll go ahead and get started. Chapter 3. Tea and Autopsies. Wadsworth's Residence. Belgrave Square, 31 August, 1888. Where are you running off to this hour? Father stood near the grandfather clock in the foyer, his tone striking the same nervous chord as the beastly antique, while he checked his pocket watch. Only a handful of years separated Uncle and Father, and up until recently, they could have passed for twins. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Worse questions were coming. The urge to flee back up the grand staircase was suddenly overwhelming. I promised Uncle Jonathan I'd join him for tea. I watched him inhale a sharp breath and added quietly, turning down his invitation would have been rude. Before he offered any more thoughts on the matter, the parlor door swung open and my brother waltzed in like a beam of sunshine set against the backdrop of a gray day. Taking quick note of the situation, he pounced. I must say, everyone appears so downright cheerful this afternoon. It's rather disturbing. Give me a proper scowl, good man. Ah, he smiled at the glare Father leveled at him. That's the spirit. Excellent job, Father. Nathaniel, Father warned, his glassy focus darting between us. This matter does not concern you. Are we terrified to let the girl out of the protective bubble again? Heaven forbid she catch pox and perish. Oh, wait! Nathaniel cocked his head. That's happened before, hasn't it? He dramatically grabbed my wrist, checking for a pulse, then staggered back. By God, Father! She's quite alive! Father's pale hand shook, and he bolted at his brow with a handkerchief. He blotted at his brow with a handkerchief, which was now a promising sign. Nathaniel usually managed to diffuse Father's anxiety with a well-placed quip. Today wasn't one of those days. I couldn't help noticing extra lines around Father's mouth, dragging his lips into a near-permanent frown. If he'd only let some of his endless worry go, it would erase a decade from his once handsome features. Strands of gray hair were also slipping in between his ashy blonde locks more and more lately. I was just telling Father I'm on my way to the carriage, I said as pleasantly as I could manage, feigning innocence of the volatile atmosphere. Feigning ignorance of the volatile atmosphere. I'm meeting Uncle Jonathan. Nathaniel clapped his gloved hands together, a sly smile spreading across his face. He couldn't resist assisting me with my chosen medical studies, mostly because my modern stance on why girls were equally capable of having a profession or apprenticeship offered endless amusement. My brother's love of arguing made him an excellent barrister in training. Okay. But his fickle attention would lead him elsewhere soon enough. His prior whims included a few months studying medicine, then art, then a horrendous effort with a violin, which went badly for all who had the misfortune of hearing him practice his scales. Though, as heir to our family legacy, he needn't learn a trade at all. It was merely something to pass idle hours and afternoons besides drinking with his pompous friends. Ah, that's right. I recall Uncle saying something about tea earlier in the week. Unfortunately, I had to decline his invitation, what with my studies and all. Adjusting his gloves and smoothing his suit, Nathaniel stepped back and grinned. Your dress is exceptional for today's weather and special occasion. 17 now, right? You're stunning, birthday girl. Don't you agree, Father? Father scrutinized my ensemble. He was probably searching for a lie to prevent me from traveling to Uncle's home, but he wouldn't find one. I'd already packed the carriage with a change of simpler clothing. If he couldn't prove I was going to practice unholy acts upon the dead and risk infection, he couldn't very well stop me. For now, I was dressed in proper afternoon tea attire. My watered silk gown was the same shade of eggshell as my silk slippers, and my corset was tight enough to remind me it was there with each painful breath I took. I was suddenly grateful for the rose-colored gloves that buttoned up to my elbows. They were a fashionable way to hide how much my palms were sweating. Father ran a hand over his tired face. "Since it's your birthday, you may go there for tea and come straight back. I do not want you going anywhere else, nor do I want you engaged in any of that." His hand fluttered around like an injured bird. "That activity your uncle is involved with. Understood?" I nodded, relieved, but Father wasn't through. "Should anything happen to your sister," he said, staring at my brother, "I will hold you responsible." Father held Nathaniel's gaze for a moment longer, then stalked from the room, leaving us in the wake of his storm. I watched as his broad form disappeared down the hallway and until he slammed the door of his study shut with one backward swipe of his hand. I knew he'd light a cigar soon and lock himself away until morning, thoughts and memories of Mother plaguing him until he fell into a troubled sleep. I turned my attention to Nathaniel as he pulled out his favorite silver comb and ran it through his hair. Not one golden strand could ever be out of place, else the universe might possibly explode. "A bit warm for leather gloves, don't you think?" Nathaniel shrugged. "I'm on my way out." As much as I wanted to speak with my brother, I had serious engagements that needed attending. Uncle was a creature of many habits, and tardiness was not tolerated, no matter that it was my birthday. Personally, I didn't think the dead would mind waiting 5 minutes to be cut open and explored, but I didn't dare say that out loud. I was there to learn, not ignite the demon sometimes lurking within him. Last time I questioned this rule, Uncle had me sopping bloody sawdust up for a month. I wasn't keen on receiving that punishment again. Blood had crusted my nail beds, and it was terrible to clean away before supper. Thank goodness Aunt Amelia hadn't been visiting. She would have fainted at the sight. "Do you want to have lunch tomorrow?" I asked. "I can call Martha to prepare something for us to bring to Hyde Park if you'd like. We can even walk around the Serpentine." Nathaniel smiled a bit sadly. "Perhaps we can take a belated birthday stroll around the lake next week. I'd certainly like to know what you and Uncle Cadaver are up to in that house of horrors." His eyes sparkled with a hint of trouble. "I worry about you seeing all that blood. Can't be good for your fragile womanly temperament." "Oh, where in a medical dictionary does it say a woman cannot handle such things? What is a man's soul made of that a woman's is not?" I teased. "I had no idea my innards were composed of cotton and kittens, while yours were filled with steel and steam-driven parts." His voice softened, getting to the heart of what was truly bothering him. "Father will go berserk if he discovers what you're really doing. I fear his grasp on reality is most delicate these days. His delusions are becoming worrisome." "How so?" I caught him sharpening knives and talking to himself the other morning when he thought everyone was still asleep. He rubbed his temples, his smile fading. "Perhaps he thinks he can stab germs before they enter our home now." This was troubling news indeed. Last time Father got this way, he'd made me wear a facial mask each time I left the house to avoid breathing contagions. While I'd like to fancy myself above things such as vanity, I'd hated the stares I'd received when venturing out. Going through that again would be torturous. I plastered on a big smile. "You worry too much." I kissed him on the cheek before heading for the door, my own tone lightening again. "If you're not careful, you'll end up losing all of your luxuriant hair." Nathaniel chuckled at that. "Duly noted. Happy birthday, Audrey Rose. I do hope you have a wonderful time with whatever it is you're up to. Be careful, though. You know Uncle can be a bit mad." 20 minutes later, I was standing in the basement of Uncle's laboratory, getting acclimated to the smell of someone else's nightmare. Dead flesh had a sickeningly sweet undertone that always took a bit of time getting used to. Fresh, unharmed bodies gave off a scent similar to raw chicken. Bodies deceased for a few days were a bit harder to ignore, no matter how much experience one had with them. Miss Nichols was murdered less than a day ago, but the strong dead rat scent, that's a description, okay, rat scent, confirmed her injuries were brutal. I said a silent prayer for her troubled soul and ravaged body before fully stepping into the room. A gas ceiling lamp threw sinister shadows against the brocade wallpaper, while two familiar figures peered over a corpse laid out on the mortuary table. It didn't take a genius to deduce the body belonged to our subject from class, and the extra person in the room was my infuriating classmate. I knew from experience not to interrupt Uncle while he was examining evidence, and was especially grateful for that rule when he described the mutilated neck again, in even greater detail, for Thomas. There was something familiar about the woman, and I couldn't stop myself from imagining her life prior to ending up before us. Perhaps there were people who loved her, a husband or children, and were mourning her loss this very moment, no longer caring that she'd fallen on hard times. Death was not prejudiced by mortal things such as station or gender. It came for kings and queens and prostitutes alike, often leaving the living with regrets. What might we have done differently if we'd known the end was so near? I shut those thoughts off. I was wandering dangerously close to an emotional door I'd already locked. Distraction was something I needed, and thankfully, this was the perfect place for that very thing. Mahogany shelves lined the walls around the room with hundreds of glass specimen jars. They had been carefully catalogued and displayed in alphabetical order, a task I was given last autumn and had only recently finished. Overall, I'd counted nearly 700 different samples, a brilliant collection for a museum, let alone a single household. I trailed a finger over the preserved body nearest me. The label written in my tiny cursive identified it as a cross-section of a frog. The dull ammonia scent of formalin permeated everything in the subterranean layer, even the sweetness of decay, but was strangely comforting nonetheless. I quietly picked up the liver I'd removed yesterday and added it to the shelves. It was my very first addition to them. My attention snagged on what I assumed were Miss Nicholas' clothes. Bloodstains were hard to see on the dark material. However, given the nature of her attack, I knew they were there. Small lace-up boots were covered in mud, smudging the table on which they rested. They were well worn, telling of her poverty. A chill, having nothing to do with the Maccabi scene unfolding across the room, crawled down my spine. Keeping the temperature quite low in this part of the house was essential, else specimens rotted too fast. The less constricting muslin dress I was wearing now offered less in the way of protection against the chilly air. Muslin or muslin? Maybe muslin. Anyway. But I preferred working in it over my finer corseted one, even as I rubbed the goose flesh from my arms. I scanned the wall opposite me, containing medical journals and tools that, to an outside observer, might seem a bit frightening. The curved, scythe-like blade of an amputation knife, the bone saws, the imposing glass and metal syringes wouldn't be out of place in a Gothic novel, such as both Nathaniel's and my favorite childhood, Frankenstein. They could easily be thought of as the devil's design, if one was inclined to think such superstitious notions, like father. The room's eerie silence was broken as Uncle called out basic facts such as height, gender, and hair and eye color while scouring. Oops, turning one too many pages. While scouring the body for other traumas sustained during the murder. Facts I had already memorized from my journal entry. I watched Thomas write notes onto a medical sheet with mechanical precision, his fingers more ink-stained than they were in class. Note-taking was generally my area of assistance during these procedures. I stood patiently, breathing in the chemical air and listening to the gentle sounds of flesh splaying, trying to ignore the sick churn of my gut. Settling my nerves always took several moments. A few breaths later, Uncle noticed me standing in the corner and signaled for me to grab an apron and join them. As I moved closer to the cadaver, it was as if a door had closed between my heart and head, sealing all emotions on the opposite side. Once I was standing over the body, I no longer saw the person she was in life. I only saw the shell left behind, and curiosity took hold in the worst of ways. She'd morphed from a kindly enough-looking woman into another faceless corpse. I'd had plenty of experience with them this summer. Strips of cloth covered parts of her to keep her decent, though there wasn't anything decent about her state. Her skin was paler than the finest hand-painted pottery Mother had inherited from her grandmother in India, except along her jawline, where dark bruising was evident. Hard living stole the softness of I imagined she once had, and death was not gentle when it took her in its unforgiving embrace. At least her eyes were closed. That was where the semi-peacefulness ended. According to Uncle, she was missing 5 teeth, and her tongue had also sustained a laceration, indicating she was likely struck to either stun or knock her unconscious before the throat slitting. Those were the kinder injuries. My gaze drifted to her lower abdomen, where a major injury was located on her left side. Uncle Jonathan hadn't exaggerated in class. This cut was jagged and extremely deep. A few smaller slices ran along the right side of her torso, but weren't nearly as bad, from what I could tell. I saw why Uncle thought someone who had use of both hands might be responsible. The bruising on her jaw indicated someone had grabbed her face with the left hand, and the incision on the right side of her body was most likely made by someone using the right. Unless there was more than one butcher on the loose. I shook my head and focused on her upper body again. The knife wounds to her neck told of an attack bred by violence. They were surprisingly easy to look at in my new emotionally detached state, however, and I wondered briefly if Aunt Amelia would say that was another strike against my moral character. "Girls should be concerned with lace, not moral disgrace," she'd say. I dreamed of a day when girls would wear lace and makeup, or no makeup at all, and don burlap sacks if they desired, to their chosen profession without it being deemed inappropriate. Uncle suddenly jumped back and sneezed. Thoughts of contracting airborne diseases crowded into my brain. I collected myself for a minute. Father's fears would not become my own and hold me back from what needed to be done. Uncle snapped his fingers, pointing to one of 4 surgical knives lying on a metal tray. I snatched it up and handed it to him, grabbing each used tool and setting it in an alcohol bath after he was through with it. When it came time for the organ removal, I had individual trays and specimen glass ready before Uncle asked for them. I knew my job well. He grunted his approval, then weighed the kidneys one at a time. The left kidney is approximately 137 grams. Thomas scratched the information down, quickly returning his focus to my uncle's next words. He was silent while absorbed in his work, my presence like a piece of furniture, wholly unnoticed until needed. The right is a bit on the small side, coming in around 119. Uncle removed a small piece of each organ, placing them on petri dishes for further testing. This same routine went on for the heart, liver, intestines, and brain. My uncle's clean white apron gradually became bloodier, but he methodically washed his hands after each dissection to avoid contaminating the evidence. There was no proof such contaminations could occur, but Uncle had his own theories on the matter. "Conventional society be damned," he bellowed. "I know what I know." Not much separated him from a butcher in appearance. I supposed even deceased humans were nothing more than animals being flayed open in the name of science instead of nourishment. Everything looked the same when you removed its top layers. I nearly laughed out loud at my absurd thoughts. Twice a year, Aunt Amelia and Cousin Liza stayed with us. Part of their visit included socializing me with girls my age by hosting lavish tea parties. Aunt Amelia hoped I'd continue attending them on my own, but I'd put an end to that. The girls at tea didn't understand my mind, which was precisely why I declined their invitations over the last several months. I hated the pity in their eyes and couldn't imagine explaining my afternoons to them. Some of them found it obscene to dip their butter knives into lemon curd. What horror they'd feel at seeing my scalpel disappearing into bloody tissue. Something cool and wet seeped into the bottom of my shoes. I hadn't noticed the pool of blood I'd been standing in. I quickly fetched a bag of sawdust and sprinkled it across the floor like a fine layer of tan-colored snow. I'd have to get rid of my slippers before I went home later. No need to frighten my newest lady's maid any more than I normally did when I came home splattered in the day's work. Uncle snapped his fingers, returning me to the task at hand. Once I disinfected the bone saw Uncle used to open the cranium and laid it back on the shelf, the autopsy was complete. Uncle Jonathan stitched the body together like a skilled tailor whose medium was flesh instead of fine fabric. I watched as the Y incision he'd made earlier turned from darkened crimson to black thread. Out of the corner of my eye I saw Thomas furiously sketching the body in its last state. His pencil slowing, then speeding across the paper. I gradually had to admit his drawing was really quite good. The details he captured would aid us with the investigation once the body was taken back to the morgue. "Do you recognize the deceased, Audrey Rose?" My attention snapped to Uncle. He was removing his apron, his gaze locked onto mine. I bit my lip, studying the woman's mangled face. There was that gnawing sense of familiarity, but I still couldn't place her. I slowly shook my head, feeling defeated. She worked in your household, briefly. Guilt sunk its claws into me. I still didn't recognize the poor woman. What a wretched thing, taking no notice of someone in my very own home. Miss Nichols deserved better from me, and the world. I felt utterly terrible. Uncle turned to the sink. You would have been ill at the time. Thomas jerked his attention up, reading my body for any signs of lingering disease, as if he even cared. He was probably worried this news might pose some sort of potential hazard for himself. My face burned, and I busied myself with the specimens. What have either of you learned from our little exercise today? Uncle Jonathan interrupted my thoughts, scrubbing his hands and forearms with a block of carbolic soap. Any interesting theories? I jumped at the opportunity to speak my mind now that we weren't surrounded by students. A small part of me was also excited for a chance to show off my theories in front of Thomas. I wanted him to see he wasn't the only one with an interesting mind. Whoever is responsible for the murder must have some sort of training in the medical field, I said. He might even be a mortuary student, or someone who's taken surgical classes at the very least. Uncle nodded. Good. Tell me more. Feeling bolstered by Uncle's approval, I circled the body. She might have been grabbed by her face, then received a blow rendering her unconscious. I thought of the incisions and areas of the body that were injured. Also, she might have been brought elsewhere. Our murderer needed time to perform his surgery without interruption. An image of our former servant being beaten, then dragged to some forgotten cellar or other damp, shadowy place set my skin crawling around my body like worms in a graveyard. Though I didn't remember her, the mere thought of her living and breathing and working in my house made me feel responsible for her in a way. I wanted to help her now in death, though I'd failed her miserably in life. Maybe she'd still be alive and reputably employed if I'd been brave enough to speak out against Father's chronic need to change staff every few weeks. My hands fisted at my sides. I refused, absolutely refused, to let this cruel treatment of a woman stand. I'd do everything in my power to solve this case for Miss Nichols, and for any other voiceless girl or woman society ignored. Mother would have done the same. All other thoughts left my mind in place of the horrific reality we were dealing with. He must have slit her throat in a location where a large amount of blood wouldn't draw attention. Possibly he took her to the slaughterhouse and did it there. Thomas snorted from his station near the body. I whipped around to properly glare at him, removing the ties from my apron, with as much venom as I could inject into the action, and tossing into a laundry bin. I knew my face must have been flushed again, but hoped he'd misinterpret the cause. Why is that funny, Mr. He composed himself and stood. Mr. Thomas Cresswell at your service, Miss Wadsworth. Bending slightly at the waist in a mock bow, he came to his full, impressive height and smiled. I find it amusing because it's an extraordinary amount of work for our murderer, hauling her off to the slaughterhouse after he went through the trouble of knocking her unconscious. He tisked. Seems rather unnecessary. Pardon me, but you don't... Thomas closed the journal he'd been sketching in and walked around the corpse, rudely speaking over me. Especially when he could easily slice her open at the river, allowing evidence to wash away without dirtying his hands further. Not to mention, he pointed to her soiled boots. The mud caked onto her heels. I scrunched my nose as if something worse than rotten flesh was in the air. I hated the fact I'd missed making the connection between the dirt on her boots and the muddy banks of the river. I hated even more that Thomas hadn't missed it. Hasn't rained here in almost a week, he went on, and there are a number of dark corners near the Thames ripe for leather aprons picking. You just stated it was ridiculous to presume he killed her at the slaughterhouse, I said, narrowing my eyes. Now you've gone and called him a leather apron? I was referencing the leather apron. Haven't you seen a paper this afternoon? Thomas studied me as if I were a specimen he'd possibly like to dissect, surely choosing the perfect silken shoes. Isn't more important than finding a blood-crazed murderer. Yet, look at those things on your feet, getting all stained and gory. Is your interest in science simply an attempt at finding a husband? Shall I grab my coat then? He flashed a roughish grin at my scowl. I'm sure your uncle won't mind stopping his investigation to chaperone us. He turned to Uncle. Would you, Dr. Wadsworth? I do admit your niece is quite beautiful. I averted my gaze. I'd forgotten less frilly shoes in my mad rush to exit the house. Not that there was anything wrong with my slippers. If I choose to wear them to post-mortems, it's my choice and my choice alone. Perhaps I'd do it from now on simply to irk him. You know an awful lot about how this murderer thinks, I said sweetly. Perhaps we should investigate your whereabouts that evening, Mr. Cresswell. He gazed at me, a dark brow arched in contemplation. I swallowed hard but held his stare. A minute later he nodded as if coming to some sort of conclusion about me. If you're going to follow me around at night, Miss Wadsworth, his attention flicked to my feet. I'd advise you to wear more sensible shoes. I opened my mouth to retort, however. Mr. Thomas Cresswell spoke over me again. Brash fool. The leather apron is what they're calling our murderer. He moved around the examination table, stalking closer to where I stood. I wanted to back away, but he held me in his magnetic orbit. He stopped before me, a softness briefly flashing across his features, and my heart picked up speed. Lord help the girl he set those eyes on for good. His boyish vulnerability was a weapon, powerful and disarming. I was thankful I wasn't the kind of girl to lose my mind over a handsome face. He'd need to work a bit harder to gain my affection. To answer your earlier question, Dr. Wadsworth, he said, tearing his gaze from mine, his tone more serious than before. I fully believe this is only the beginning. What we have on our hands is the start of a career murderer. No one with that kind of surgical prowess would commit one murder, then stop. His lips quirked slightly when he noticed my incredulous expression. I know I wouldn't. One taste of warm blood is never enough, Miss Wadsworth. Ooh! So, I wonder, is he the Ripper? I don't know. So, that was the end of chapter 3. And that was also page 31. It seems to be going on for a while. But like I said, I don't really know how long this video will be. And this is going to be a good learning experience for, where I get to. I'll see how long this video turns out to be. And then I'll see, okay, maybe I just need to read one chapter at a time. Or if it's a really short one, too, or something like that. So we'll see. And as with the other chapters, this one starts off with a picture as well. Chapter 4. I think you can see it. It looks to be of some kind of building. The Princess Alice C. 1880s. Okay. Guess it's a building. So hopefully you're enjoying it. So far, I'm liking where the story's going. I'm liking the era it's set in. Her demeanor. So we have to do 49. So page 49 is actually in the middle of chapter 5. So chapter 4 is a really short one. So hopefully we'll get through this, and this video will not be an hour long. But if it is, I apologize, and maybe somebody out there is okay with vlog videos. Alright, I shall continue. Ta-da! Chapter 4. A Dance with the Devil. Dum dum dum. Back at so it's still Wadsworth Residence in Belgrave Square. The date is 7 September 1888. Leather Apron and the Whitechapel Murderer were the headlines of the last week. Everywhere I looked, a new theory was introduced by another supposed expert in the field. Detective inspectors had several doctors examine the body of Miss Nichols, and for the most part, they'd all come to the same conclusions as Uncle Jonathan. Most everyone disagreed with Uncle's theory of her being assaulted while standing, however. They did agree her throat was slashed prior to the incisions made along her abdomen, and that whoever was responsible was unlikely to simply stop now. East End residents were terrified to go out after sunset, fearing every shadowy figure was the depraved murderer. Prostitutes were warned to be on high alert, but their need to pay for lodging kept them from completely abandoning the streets. My father was worse than ever, coming unhinged, it seemed, every time I left the house. It was becoming harder to sneak about or come up with excuses for leaving that he didn't question. He'd let go of all our maids and hired a whole new lot. His paranoia of them infecting our family with Lord only knew what was overshadowing his reason. There was no point telling him that new servants were more likely to bring infection in as they'd been outside our home and in the scary disease-spreading world. Pretty soon I feared he'd be escorting me everywhere himself. Unfortunately, that meant attending Uncle's forensic medicines class had become nearly impossible. Though I was fortunate I could still make it to the laboratory. I fully believe this is only the beginning. Mr. Thomas Cresswell's ominous warning replayed through my head each passing day. It felt like the uneasy stillness before the storm, and I found myself even more restless than usual at night. I had a hard time fully believing his theory, though. The thought of any more murders taking place was simply out of the question. I'd never heard of a career murderer before. It seemed Thomas was looking for another outlet to show off his brilliance, and I wanted nothing more than to prove him wrong, potentially earning more of Uncle's respect in the process. Between my desire for Uncle's approval and my connection to Miss Nichols, I was determined to help solve this case. I tried approaching my brother to discuss his thoughts on it, but he'd been preoccupied with studying and couldn't spare any time, which left me with too much time to think about death and the finality of it. Nathaniel always assured me what happened wasn't my fault, but his comfort didn't take the sting out of my chest each time Father stared at me with such overwhelming fear. As far as he was concerned, it was his duty to protect me against everything in the world. Mother didn't die nursing Nathaniel back from scarlet fever, after all. He didn't have to watch her face flush with that horrible rash and see her tongue swell because my brother had been weak. Her already damaged heart didn't break fully because Nathaniel had brought infection to our home. I couldn't help feeling as if I were Father's useless, murdering daughter who looked too much like her, a constant reminder of all he'd lost, of all I'd stolen away from him the night I took my first fever-free breath and Mother took her last. I was the reason for his growing madness, and I never let myself forget it. When I closed my eyes, I still saw the hospital staff in their long dresses and starched aprons, their solemn faces turning away from my ear-splitting screams as Mother's chest stuttered and fell still forever. I banged on her sternum with both fists, my tears falling on her beautifully stitched dressing gown, but she didn't stir again. No 12-year-old should ever have to watch her mother's soul drift into the abyss. It was the first time I'd ever felt helpless. God had failed me. I'd prayed and prayed the way Mother always said I should, and for what? Death still claimed her in the end. It was then I knew I'd rely on something more tangible than holy spirits. Science never abandoned me the way religion had that night. Forsaking the Holy Father was considered a sin, and I did it repeatedly. Each time my blade met with flesh, I sinned more and welcomed it. God no longer held dominion over my soul. This evening my thoughts were treacherously loud and impossible to quiet down. I tossed back and forth in my thin nightdress, kicked my shoes off, and finally poured myself a glass of water from a pitcher on my bedside table. Blast it all! Sleep wasn't going to find me, that much I was certain of. My limbs itched with the need to go out and do something. Or perhaps I simply needed to escape from the confines of my room and all the woeful thoughts that came with the darkness. Each day that passed was a failure to help Miss Nichols' family find peace. I had already failed her once. I would not fail again so miserably. I clenched my fists. I could do the safe and reasonable thing, waiting in Uncle's laboratory until another victim showed up, or I could act now, tonight. I could gather clues that might help, impressing both Thomas and Uncle in the process. The more I thought on it, the surer I became of my decision. Mother used to say, "Roses have both petals and thorns, my dark flower. You needn't believe something weak because it appears delicate. Show the world your bravery." Mother had had a weak heart and was kept from much physical activity as a child, but she'd found other ways to prove her strength. One needn't be strong in only physical matters. A strong mind and will were fierce to behold as well. "You're right, Mother." I paced along the deep gold Persian rug in my room, relishing the coldness of the hard wood when my soles found the edges of the carpet. Before I knew what I was doing, I found myself standing in front of my looking-glass, dressed all in black. It's time for bravery. Pulling my dark hair into a simple braid and pinning it about my crown, I tucked a few wayward strands behind my ears. My dress was a simple design with long fitted sleeves, a small bustle, and light cotton fabric. I ran my hands down the front of it, enjoying the softness and fine craftsmanship of the garment. I stared at the dark circles under my eyes that told of many sleepless nights. The paleness of my already sallow-looking skin was heavily contrasted by the black clothing, so I pinched my cheeks, giving them some much-needed color. Mother never had to worry about doing such things. Her skin was a beautiful honey, showing off her ancestry from India, and mine was a cream-laden imitation of hers. I reminded myself I need not be fashionable. I was going for stealth, though my aunt would be pleased I'd taken an interest in my appearance. Unbidden, a wretched thought flashed through my mind. Thomas and Uncle were out the evening of the first murder. They were interested in studying the human body, and Thomas had flat out lied about it. If I discovered them doing treacherous things, would they harm me? I laughed, covering my mouth to stifle the sound. What a ridiculous notion. My uncle was not capable of such acts. Thomas, however, I couldn't say for sure, but refused to follow that trail of thought. I imagined the murderer was a physician traveling abroad, or someone who was working for a physician to locate organs for study. Or perhaps some wealthy man or woman was willing to pay dearly for a transplant of some sort, though that science hadn't been effective yet. No one had ever accomplished a successful organ transplant. Either way, I doubted highly that Leather Apron was hanging around, stalking women of the night. I'd be fine, cloaked under darkness. Without allowing myself a moment's hesitation, I swiftly sneaked. I don't really like it when they say that. Sneaked out. I like snuck out, but she doesn't say that. She says sneaked. I swiftly sneaked down the stairs, crept into the drawing room, and I latched myself in. My nose is itchy. Alright. Oh crap, I lost my place. Where was I? I don't know where I was. Oh, okay. Glancing about the empty room, I released a sigh. All was quiet. I tiptoed across the floor, then opened the window farthest from the door. Placing both hands on the windowsill, I glanced over my shoulder, checking the lock once more. Father was sleeping, and he wasn't quite mad enough to check on me during the night. But the thought of being caught had my heart running double its speed. A thrill twirled through my veins as I pushed off, dropping a few feet to the patch of grass set between the stones. The few seconds of weightlessness made me feel as free as a bird soaring in the heavens. I smiled as I wiped my soft leather gloves off and slunk into the shadows surrounding the building. Father would lock me in the old coal cellar if he knew I'd sneaked away so late, which made my night adventure all the more appealing. Let him discover I was out at this indecent hour and was more than capable of taking care of myself. I welcomed the chance not only to ferret out helpless clues for our investigation, but to prove Father's fears irrational as well, even if there was potentially a madman on the loose. My quest began losing its appeal the longer I slipped in and out of the dimness of London's abandoned streets. I couldn't take the carriage without Father learning of my shameful activities, and trekking through the cobblestone streets for nearly an hour wasn't as bold and daring as I'd imagined it to be. I was cold and the streets stank of waste. Needles pricked between my shoulder blades. I had the horrible feeling I was being watched. I nearly fainted when a silly old cat ran into my path. Down the block I heard a commotion and slipped into the closest alleyway to avoid being seen. Voices carried over the rolling fog, adding a haunted feeling to the already eerie streets. I counted my breaths, waiting for the people to pass by, praying no one would slink into my hiding place. Wind tickled the back of my neck, raising goose flesh. I didn't like being trapped between buildings. I hadn't really thought of what I'd say should I encounter someone at this hour. All I'd been thinking was I'd spy on the pubs Miss Nichols had visited prior to her death, possibly learn some new fact or clue from the people deep in their drink, and outsmart Thomas Cresswell. Perhaps I should have prepared myself a bit more instead of being motivated by the desire to show off my own intelligence to such an obnoxious yet damnably brilliant boy. I glanced up through the light fog at the cross street, Hanbury. How had I gotten this far over? I was nearly to the Princess Alice, but had traveled a touch out of the way. The next few streets should take me to Wentworth and Commercial. Without waiting for the drunken couple to pass, I willed myself to take on the stealth of an apparition floating soundlessly down the alley and across the road. My feet took sturdy steps. Though a feather could have knocked me over, my heart was pounding so hard. Halfway through the alley, a pebble knocked out of place behind me. I whirled to see. Nothing. No scythe-wielding murderer or drunken bar patron. Only an empty black space between buildings. Must have been a rat crawling through rubbish. I stood for a few more beats, waiting, my heart thrashing against my ribs like a fish taken from water. I feared a monster would be standing behind me, breathing its rotten breath down my neck should I turn around, so I closed my eyes. Somehow, everything seemed easier to manage when I couldn't see, though it was a foolish, foolish thing to do. Pretending a monster wasn't there didn't make it go away, it only made one vulnerable to its attack. I listened hard. When no other sounds occurred, I moved swiftly away, tossing glances over my shoulder to be certain I was alone. Once I saw the lively pub in front of me, I took a deep breath. I'd much rather take my chances with drunken ruffians than the shadows stalking the night. The brick building stood 3 stories tall and was prominently placed between 2. So, part of the learning curve, I guess you have to charge these things because it died. So now I've got it on a 10-foot cable thingy. So we can continue, but it started to make this clicky noise, and I'm like, so when you saw me get like close, I was like, what's happening? It turned off and died. So I know where I was at, so I'm going to continue, and I actually just realized that we're at like 45 minutes already, so I'm like, well, crap! This is going to be probably another hour-long video, so I'm thinking it's probably going to have to be not till each time we get to a gift, but like a chapter. So the video that I'll do tomorrow, I'll maybe just read 1 chapter, see how long that is, and then we'll go from there. So bear with me while I learn. But then I was thinking about it. Maybe it's not such a bad thing for the videos to be an hour long. I know that people's YouTube channels are all different lengths. I've been told and seen some that are an hour long, some that are 30 minutes long, 5 minutes long, 15 minutes long. And then somebody was telling me about like the clips, or they're like I think they call them vines. I don't know, or they're like 3 seconds. So maybe it's not such a bad thing. Alrighty, well, sorry if you were getting into it and listening. I shall continue on from where we were so rudely interrupted in our book, because now we are on we're about to be on page 40. We're like 3 sentences until page 40, so we only have 9 pages to go to get to the gift. I'm so excited. Alrighty. So I'll reread a few sentences, so then that way we can just kind of get back into it. I'm trying to figure out where I want to start. Okay. Once I saw the lively pub in front of me, I took a deep breath. I'd much rather take my chances with drunken ruffians than the shadows stalking the night. The brick building stood 3 stories tall and was prominently placed between 2 streets, giving it a triangular shape in the front. Noise and the clinking clatter of plates and glasses filtered out through the front doors, along with the rowdy laughter and words no lady should hear. Sinking my teeth into my lower lip, I eyed some of the more surly patrons. I'm getting this all cray-cray in view. I rethought my earlier fear of shadows. Yay, page 40! Some men were covered in soot, while others had blood spattered along the cuffs of their rolled sleeves, butchers and factory workers. Their arms were corded with the look of hard labor, and their rough accents spoke of poverty. My fragile aristocratic bones stuck out even in the plainest dress. I cursed the bustle and finely stitched seams apparent even in the dark, and contemplated turning back. I refused to be defeated so easily by fear or a well-made garment. Squaring my shoulders, I took one giant step toward the crowd before being dragged backward by an unseen force. I opened my mouth to scream but was quickly silenced by a large hand covering the lower half of my face. The grasp wasn't hard, but I couldn't gain enough leeway to bite down on my assailant. I kicked and jerked about to no avail. The only thing I managed to do was to wrap my blasted skirts around my legs, tumbling into my assailant, allowing him a bit more ease in his unholy mission. I was at the mercy of this invisible demon, powerless to break free of its supernatural grasp. Please, don't scream, you'll ruin everything. His voice was far too amused, given the situation. At least he wasn't an apparition then. I wrestled with everything I had, twisting and knocking my head against his chest. If he wasn't so tall, I might have connected with his head. We're going somewhere quiet. Then we can talk, all right? I nodded slowly, collecting my racing thoughts. Somehow that voice was familiar. He gently pulled me into the shadows, our bodies pressed together most inappropriately, and even though I thought I recognized his voice, I didn't make his job easy. I'd show him how right my mother was about roses having both petals and thorns. Digging my heels in, I kicked and tried scratching his arms with little success. We stumbled into the alley, our limbs knocking together, and he oomphed as my elbow connected with his stomach. Good. If I died now, at least I'd have some satisfaction of having injured the beast. My momentary victory was short-lived. My bulky skirts weighed down any more attempts at fleeing, and the monstrous fog finally swallowed us whole. Once we were far enough away from the pub and the gas lamps lining the cobbled streets, my attacker released me as promised. My chest heaved with fear and rage. Bracing myself for a fight, I spun on my heel, blinking disbelief away. Thomas Cresswell stood with his arms crossed at his chest, a slight frown turning down his handsome features. He, too, was dressed solidly in black, with the addition of a cap pulled low over his brow. His profile cast sharp shadows in the waning light. There was an almost dangerous aura about him, cautioning me away, but anger seethed through my veins. I was going to kill him. Are you completely mad? Was that necessary? I demanded, both fists planted on my hips to avoid strangling him. You could have simply asked me to follow you, and what do you think you're doing skulking along the streets at this ungodly hour? He eyed me warily, then ran a hand down his tired-looking face. If I didn't know any better, I'd think he'd possibly been worried. I could ask the same of you, Miss Wadsworth, but I'd rather save that spectacle for your brother. I didn't have time to finish my sentence before Nathaniel appeared like the ghost of Christmas past, looking less than amused. For once, I was without words. Nathaniel nodded toward Thomas, then grabbed me roughly by my elbow, pulling me deeper into the shadows and out of earshot. I wrenched around, glaring, but Thomas's attention was fixed on the arm Nathaniel was latched onto, the muscle in his jaw clenching. His reaction confounded me enough to go along with my brother peacefully. Please spare me any of your ridiculous stories, sister. Oops, I turned too many pages. Nathaniel whispered harshly when we were far enough away. I don't even want to know why you thought it a fine idea to trapeze around darkened streets while a murderer is stalking women. Do you have some sort of death wish? I got the impression this was a rhetorical question. I kept quiet by squeezing the material of my skirts between my fingers. What I wanted to do was shake his rough hand off my elbow where he was still gripping me a bit too hard. I also wanted to scold him for being as overprotective as father and reacting hysterically, but couldn't bring myself to do either of those things. Nathaniel released me, then tugged at his fine leather gloves until his face slowly returned to a more natural color instead of the blazing red of the Queen's Guard. He sighed, running a hand through his fine hair. Losing Mother was bad enough. His voice caught and he coughed the emotion away, yanking his comb out from beneath his overcoat. Don't expect me to sit back and watch you recklessly endanger yourself, little sister. His eyes dared me to say one stupid thing. It would destroy me, understand? As quickly as my temper flared, my ire was quelled. For the last 5 years, it was the two of us against the world. Father was too lost in sorrow to really be present. Putting myself in Nathaniel's place, I could see the minute cracks of my emotions shattering should I ever lose him. I'm sorry for worrying you, Nathaniel, truly. I meant every word of the apology. Then a thought struck. I narrowed my eyes. Why, might I ask, are you trolling around back alleyways with that devil, Mr. Cresswell? If you must know, Nathaniel said a bit haughtily, adjusting his collar. "We're not the only ones out here." Now this had my full attention. I raised a brow, waiting while my brother scanned the abandoned area around us. "A group of us are doing a bit of our own inquiry. We've taken up posts throughout Whitechapel and are looking for suspicious persons. We're calling ourselves the Knights of Whitechapel." I blinked. The only people who looked sorely out of place were my well-dressed brother and his ridiculous hat-wearing lackey. I could only imagine what the rest of the high-born boys looked like in this neighborhood. "The Knights of Whitechapel?" I repeated. My brother wasn't capable of hurting a common housefly. I hated imagining what some diabolical killer might do to him out here in the dark. "You cannot be serious, Nathaniel. What would you possibly do if you came face to face with this murderer? Offer him a silver comb or perhaps some fine, fresh wine?" French wine, not fresh wine. "Some fine French wine?" A dark look crossed my brother's face. "You'd be surprised what I'd manage should the need arise." Nathaniel gritted his teeth. "He'd soon discover he's not the only one who can induce fear. Now then." He ankled me back down the alleyway toward the lone figure standing near the inn. "Mr. Cresswell will see that you make it home safely." The last thing I wanted was to be escorted home by Mr. Thomas Cresswell. He was quite smug enough. "If you're staying out here, then so am I." I planted my feet, refusing to budge, but Nathaniel simply dragged me behind him as if I were made of feathers. "No, you're not." He handed me off to my classmate. "Take the carriage to my house, Thomas. I'll come back on foot later." If Thomas was annoyed with Nathaniel bossing him around like a common servant, he didn't show it. He simply wrapped his long fingers around my arm, tethering me to his side. I hated the surge of my pulse at his touch, but no longer struggled to break free. I stole a glance, noticing the smirk on his face. Itchy. We good now. I will continue. He didn't grip me as if I were an unruly child in need of scolding, choosing instead to hold me back from Nathaniel as if he were the one in need of rescuing. It was high time someone noticed I was capable of looking after myself, even if that someone was an infuriating boy, an intelligent, arrogant, handsome boy. I stood a little straighter, and Thomas chuckled, a delicious rumbling sound I wouldn't mind hearing again. My brother spared me one last look. "Be sure to place the stick atop that windowsill in the drawing room." He smiled broadly at the death glare I leveled at him. "Sorry, little sister, but I do believe you've had enough excitement for one evening. Count your blessings you encountered only the two of us out here and not someone more sinister." "Come," Thomas said, directing me toward the carriage. "Your brother's right. Something wicked lurks in these shadows." I twisted around to stare at him. "Something more wicked than you?" Thomas opened his mouth before catching on to my teasing, then laughed in a way that set my heart racing again. Perhaps he was the most dangerous thing I could encounter out here, and my brother hadn't a clue. One fact was slowly taking shape. I was in jeopardy of admiring Mr. Cresswell against my better judgment. A gust of wind tangled my hair, bringing with it a chill that caressed my skin. I glanced around for my brother, but he'd already been taken by the fog. Sweet, we're on page 45, and we are starting chapter 5. So this is going to be an awkward place to end, but I'm going to end it when we open the new gift. That's the secret mystery gift for page 49, which is going to be in a few pages, which is not the end of this chapter. But that's okay. So it'll just keep you waiting for tomorrow. And I'm still contemplating whether or not I'm going to start some other books that I'm more familiar with reading and post them as well. But if that's the case, then I've got to get a hold of my copy of I Am Number 4 and maybe choose a romance-y novel for the adult read, and then maybe even a children's book. So I might read a little children's book, so that way if, parents are bored and they, want 15 minutes or so of quiet time, they can go and prepare their kids' lunch or something and be like, "Here, watch this girl read this book," and show you pretty pictures. So, I don't know yet. We'll see. Let me continue. Chapter 5. Dark and Hideous Things. Wadsworth Resident, Belgrave Square, 8 September 1888. You're looking rather unwell this morning. Father glanced at me over his paper. Perhaps you ought to return to bed. I'll send up some broth. Last thing we need is to have you coming down with an influenza or worse, especially as winter draws near. He set the paper down and wiped his brow with a handkerchief. Out of our family members, Father was the only one who appeared unwell. He'd been perspiring a lot lately. Are you feeling all right, Father? You look a bit... How I look is not your concern, he snapped, then quickly amended. You needn't worry about my health, Audrey Rose. Attend to yourself. I should like it very much if you didn't leave the house again for some time. I've heard more diseases spreading in the slums. After adding a few drops of tonic to his tea, he continued reading the news. I wanted to point out that gaining an immunity to certain things would keep me healthier, and the only way to gain such immunity was by leaving the house. But he'd never tolerated my knowledge of science or medicine. Keeping me in a bubble equaled safety to him, no matter how wrong that notion was. He sipped from his tea, his presence filling the room but not warming it. My attention drifted to the clock. I needed to meet with Uncle soon. Nathaniel was still sleeping, so I was on my own for leaving the house. I politely cleared my throat. I'm in need of some new dresses and shoes. I dropped my gaze, peering up through my lashes, feigning embarrassment, and other more delicate items. Father waved me off, thoughts of corsets and undergarments too much for him to hear about, despite his fears of my poor health. He blotted at his nose with the same handkerchief, then returned it to his pocket. Do what you must, he said, but be home in time for supper and your lesson on running a proper household. Your aunt says you showed little improvement last time she visited. I fought the urge to roll my eyes at his predictability. Yes, Father. Oh, he said, wiping his brow once more. Wear a mask when you leave today. There's talk of more East End sickness. I nodded. The mask was nothing more than a cotton neckerchief I tied about my nose and mouth. I doubted it would protect me from anything. Satisfied with my obedience, he went back to reading, the sound of his teacup hitting the saucer, his sniffling, and the flipping of pages out over pages, our only talkative companions. Huh. Oh dear. Then it's got a line break, if you could see that. Line break that says, ghastly murder in Whitechapel. This is probably going to be a newspaper thing. I read the headline aloud to my uncle while he paced in front of the specimen jars in his basement laboratory. The deep burgundy wallpaper was normally a warm backdrop against the frigid temperature. And even colder bodies adorning the examination table most days. Today, however, the red tones reminded me of spilled blood, and I'd had my fill of that substance lately. I rubbed my hands over the thin sleeves of my muslin day dress and scanned the article. There was no mention of the new body they'd found this morning. It was still detailing poor Miss Nichols's death. The killer had taken mercy on her compared to the nefarious acts he'd committed on victim number 2. I watched Uncle absently twist his mustache while doing his best to carve a path in the carpet. If he kept walking back and forth, I feared he'd wear that through the wooden floorboards soon enough. Why position the body in such a manner? It was the same question he'd been asking himself since arriving from the latest murder over 2 hours ago. I had no theories to offer him. I was still trying to divorce myself from the abhorrent diagram he'd sketched on the chalkboard earlier. My attention drifted to the disfigured image he'd created, drawn against my will like a magnet to the unimaginable gore. I studied the words scrawled above the detailed drawing. Miss Annie Chapman, aged 47, approximately 5 feet tall, blue eyes, shoulder-length, dark brown, wavy hair. An entire life distilled into 5 basic physical descriptions. She'd been murdered on Hanbury Street, the very street I'd found myself on late last night. A chill worked its way deep into my bones, settling between my vertebrae like pigeons roosting on a clothesline. Mere hours separated her untimely end and my dance with danger. Was it possible I'd been so close to the murderer? Nathaniel was right to be worried. I'd practically run into Leather Apron's all-too-eager arms by sneaking around like a child during the witching hour. Should anything happen to me, Father would lose what was left of his mind, locking himself away in that study until he finally died of a broken heart. What if tossing her intestines about her... What of tossing her intestines about her shoulder? Uncle paused before the diagram, staring past it at a memory not captured on the board. What was it, a message for the inspectors, or the easiest way to get what organ he sought? Perhaps, I offered. Uncle turned to me, astonished, as if he'd forgotten I was there. He shook his head. Lord knows why I allow you to learn such unseemly things for a girl. On occasion, Uncle would mutter such annoyances. I learned to ignore them for the most part, knowing he'd forget his hesitations quickly enough. Because you love me? Uncle sighed. Yes. And a brain such as yours shouldn't be wasted on frippery and gossip, I suppose. My focus found the drawing again. The woman who'd taken my measurements earlier resembled the deceased woman's description nearly perfectly. Keeping up the pretense of my whereabouts her father, I'd stopped by the dressmaker's shop on the way in, picking out rich fabrics and new styles to be sent to the house. I decided on a walking dress made of deep navy with gold and cream stripes. The bustle was smaller than my others, and the hefty material would be perfect for the cooler weather. My absolute favorite was a tea gown I'd chosen to wear when receiving visitors. It was the color of spun sugar, with tiny roses embroidered along its front. A soft pink robe completed the loose-fitting gown cascading to the floor. Honestly, I couldn't wait for them to be ready. Just because I studied cadavers didn't mean I couldn't appreciate beautiful garments. My thoughts returned to the matter at hand. Had the seamstress not been reputably employed, she very well could have ended up on the streets and eventually in Uncle's laboratory too. Another cold corpse to slice into. I crossed the room to where a tiny table stood nestled in the corner. A maid had brought in a tray of tea and a platter of scones with raspberry jam. I poured myself a cup of Earl Grey, adding a sugar cube with ornate silver tongs. The very opulence juxtaposed to our new case was nauseating. I prepared a second cup for Uncle, leaving the scones untouched. The sanguine color of the preserves was revolting. I feared I'd never be hungry again. Uncle jerked himself out of his next reverie when I handed him the steaming cup. The sweet herbal scent mixed with bergamot transfixed his attention for a few precious beats before he continued mumbling and pacing. Where's that blasted boy? He checked the brass, anatomically correct heart clock mounted on the wall, frustration knotting his brow. It was hard to tell if he was more annoyed by the timepiece itself or by Mr. Thomas Cresswell. The clock was a gift from my father, a long-ago kindness he'd shown upon Uncle completing his medical degree. Father used to craft toys and clocks before Mother died, another joy her death had stolen from him. Whereas I shunned religion for its abandonment, Father shunned his brother and science for their failure to save Mother. When she died, Father claimed Uncle hadn't tried hard enough. Conversely, Uncle thought Father relied too heavily on a miracle he couldn't offer and was a fool to blame him for Mother's death. I couldn't imagine ever hating my brother that much and pitied them both for their animosity. I shifted my focus to the time. Thomas had left over an hour. P.S. We are on page 49, but I have to finish this sentence since it's going over. Thomas had left over an hour earlier, inquiring after the members of his vigilante group. So, yay! We are now on page 50, which, like I said, is in the middle of a chapter. But we are finally where I was supposed to be to open the gift. Which we all remember I got this one, which I love, so I'm going to stick it in the book. I'm also using it as another bookmark because it's pretty. And I want to. And I was telling you, like, when on yesterday's video, the first video, I was thinking, like, that these were Jack the Ripper's tools. Well, I realized now they're not. They're the autopsy tools. So, yay. New discoveries. Okay, so let's hope we're just excited to open another gift, which hopefully won't be as hard as the others. It looks like it only has... Oh, this one's going to be easy because the tape will come off just really easy. So let's see what we get. It's wrapped. Okay. Oh, you know what I should do? I should have learned from yesterday that I should get a trash can in here. I like to keep the little boxes because they're cute. It's not the paper. So noticing how I'm probably looking a lot more over this way than at that, but you know, whatever, I'm learning. Oh! So that's so cute. Oh my gosh, that's so cute. So they were just talking about the anatomically correct heart clock for keeping time. And this is a heart watch clock. And it has like little cute pieces on it. That is so cute. Well, I guess I will add this to what I wear for tomorrow's video. I'll wear it probably on this wrist. Maybe I won't wear this glove and so you can see it, or maybe I'll wear it over the glove. Yeah, I'll wear it over the glove. That's really cool. So my mom and dad they do really great. That is just so cute. So there it is again. The heart with love. Yay! Okay, so that completes video 2. If you like it and you want to subscribe, that would be great. If you want to leave me a comment, that would be wonderful. I'd love to read if this one's better and what I can do to continuously get better at this. Alrighty, so thank you so much. That was Reading by Ree. Bye. Gonna turn it off. Sorry if you get dizzy.